this thing working? Maybe? Hello, hello. The microphone seems to be picking up properly. Looks a little quiet, but I can't get it any louder than... Actually, maybe I can. Hello, hello. Put a limiter on this and I can boost it, the level a little bit. Hello, hello, hello. Is this better? This is a... Bop, 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 bop. There we go. I think it's better. Bring this over here. No, I'll bring this back down. Yeah. Okay, cool. Hey, so, welcome to the Ongaku Concept monthly live stream. At least the intention is for this thing to be monthly. And we're gonna talk about music theory and whatever. So, yeah, hit me up with whatever questions you guys have. You know, it could be about scales, chords, interesting songs or parts of songs or whatever. You know, opinions on how certain soundtracks work. Guitar. You know, whatever. So... Any tips for writing? So Jason Miller asks, any tips for writing in Locrian? That's a good question. So Locrian is one of the classical modes. It's essentially a minor scale with a with a lowered second and fifth. So you have 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, and flat 7. All your degrees are lowered except for the 4. Which would be a raised 3 at that point. So it's really the darkest scale you get out of the 7 modes, and it's particularly difficult to write with because you have the flat 5 there, and the 5 is, well, the 4 and 5 are your stability. They're your anchors, and so if you mess with those, it creates problems when you're trying to tonicize something, when you're trying to make it clear what key you're in. So since Locrian has a flat 5, and the 5 is more... The 5 is a little bit more important to tonicization than the 4 is. Altering the flat 5 really creates some trouble there. So I guess it really depends on how... So as for tips on writing with it, I guess it really depends on how you intend to use it, really. If you're going to be trying to make chords out of it, you may want to go ahead and raise the fifth back up to a natural here and there, depending on what you're doing. So I'll give you an example. So there's a song... Actually, I'll use, I'm sure most of you guys know what Sonic Forces is, which is the newest Sonic game. It just came out a week and a half ago. Yeah. And there's this character named Infinite. And, so here's his battle theme, which I unironically love this. So this is in the key of B minor. It's heavily utilizing the flat 2, which would be C. And that would be Phrygian if we were going to stick to that. The flat 5 is later on, in this one little interlude section. So those three notes, do, do, do. That's B, F, and B. So he's using the flat 5 there. It's very dark sounding. But he's also using the natural 5. So anytime he plays like the B power chord there, he's got the F sharp in it. And he only uses the F natural when he arpeggiates that. And so the flat 5 is really used more as an embellishment than anything else. And so you get the Locrian sound, but you also don't lose the stability, because anytime he's actually playing the tonic chord, he's got the natural 5th in there. So that allows him to keep the stability while still presenting the sound of the characteristic sound of Locrian. And of course you have the flat 2 in there in that riff as well. So if you... I'll give you another example, which sounds completely different, and it's absolutely fascinating to me. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Splatoon, but in Splatoon 2, there's this one song. Which one is it? Well, I'll find it. There's this one song from Splatoon 2, which has a section that's entirely Locrian, except the tonic chord has the natural 5th in there as well. Let me find it. Here we go. It's one of the match themes. So it's the middle section here. Where is it? Okay, so this section coming up, well, I guess it's in the key of, yeah, it's in the key of B at that point, and it's using Locrian entirely, except for the tonic chord has the natural 5th in it. Otherwise, it's all Locrian. There's your flat 2. There's the flat 5. B, F, B. So there's another example of Locrian, and it's really written the same way you would work with Phrygian. It's just using the like a power chord on the flat 5 every now and then. But the tonic chord does still have its natural 5th, and so that allows it to keep stability. So you might. Now maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to stick entirely within Locrian, you don't want to leave it, and that's perfectly fine. In that instance, though, I would recommend not writing with chords, or if you're going to, maybe try and avoid using the 5th at all in the tonic chord. You can just play the root and the 3rd and kind of let that be your foundation. And so one way to write without using chords is, well, just write, I forget the word for it, but just work with melodies. There's this one track, maybe I can find it. I think it got taken down from YouTube, but let me see. Here we go. This is a phenomenal example of Locrian. This is called Dust to Dust by John Kirkpatrick. So there's the tonic.
Digging graves is my delight, digging graves for you to lie in. Digging graves from morn till night, I earns me living from the dying.
And so, there's no harmony whatsoever. I mean, yeah, it's being harmonized like an octave with I guess it's an accordion. but beyond that, there's nothing else. I think it's absolutely a fantastic example of Locrian at work. And the only song I think that's the only song I've ever heard that's written completely with Locrian. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but there's that. So let me look through some of the other questions. I'm going to try and answer these in the order asked, if possible. So Chris, I hope I'm going to butcher all of your names, so I apologize in advance. Chris Algu asks, so it seems like the Lydian mode is the film music mode. What are some other modes or scales that are often used for other things? I don't know if it's necessarily accurate to say that Lydian is the film music mode. It is used quite frequently in film music, but generally to represent, wondrous events or awe-inspiring things that are like weird and different and fascinating, not necessarily in a threatening way. And so you'll see it associated with space quite frequently. A good example, a fairly famous example actually, is the soundtrack to Kill a Mockingbird. I forget the name of the composer. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I don't remember it. It's the soundtrack to the film adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird. The main theme of that utilizes Lydian quite heavily, and it's used throughout the soundtrack to represent a sort of childlike view of the world, because children are very, the whole world is sort of awe-inspiring to a kid because everything is new and different and interesting. And so it helps represent that idea quite a lot. And it seems that film kind of plays with those sorts of ideas frequently. So as for the other modes, I mean, Dorian's kind of Dorian's a real, I don't know what word I'm looking for. Dorian, you can use Dorian for a lot of things. It can be used kind of as a somewhat darker correspondent to Lydian. It is the relative minor of Lydian if we were to consider, if we considered Aeolian to be the relative minor of Ionian, then Dorian's the relative minor to Lydian. So you can think of it that way. Maybe if you want to express something similar to Lydian, but in a slightly more threatening or more mysterious sense, then maybe you might use Dorian. I like it applied to underwater areas, space as well, actually, for things. A good example is Egg Rocket Zone from Sonic Advance, so I'll show you that one. It's in the key of C, and it's using Dorian fairly well throughout the piece. I'll skip the intro. So that's really heavily accenting the raised sixth from Dorian's a minor scale with a raised sixth, basically. What are the others? So Phrygian. Phrygian's actually associated with Spanish music and flamenco music very heavily. That's a mode that they use very frequently, and so I think that's probably its primary association. But you hear it a lot in metal, anything darker, battle music a lot. We already went over Locrian. Mixolydian. Mixolydian's very fantasy. It's very like medieval. Dorian as well, actually. Dorian's very medieval. Shovel Knight's a good example of that. Shovel Knight, Siri, I'm not talking to you. Shovel Knight's a good example of Dorian in use. Mixolydian is a good corollary to that. The what's it called? You know, the in Chrono Trigger, the festival theme. Let me find that. This is this is Mixolydian here. So, Mixolydian is a major scale with a flattened seventh. So, it's fairly common in medieval kind of stuff, like brighter medieval kind of sounds. Yeah, I mean, Aeolian, Locrian. I don't think I'm missing any. So yeah, that's kind of what I would associate most of those with. I didn't mention Ionian and Aeolian, but I mean, you've heard those plenty. So yeah, I'll try to answer these a little quicker if I can. Maybe I should actually scroll down in the chat so I can see people's responses. Thank you, Scott. Millennial Fair. That's the name of the track that I was just looking at. Let's see. Okay, so let me look through. Okay, there we go. So Stephen Treminio is asking, what theory do you know about how chordals can be used? He means chordal harmony. Chords built out of perfect fourths. Well, I guess some people use it to refer to fourths in general. But so chordal harmony and quintal harmony, so stacked fourths or stacked fifths. That's a really interesting subject because you don't get triads out of those, so you don't get major and minor chords out of it. Not technically speaking. And we can go into that, but if you just stack a few of them together, it's pretty ambiguous. You might be familiar with well, this should be the right video.
Open your eyes.
That chord, that's stacked fifths, if I remember correctly. Maybe it's yeah, it's fifths. And it's kind of associated with Impressionism. So if you want to look up that would be a good place to look. And they're really, well, they're very impressive chords. They're very ambiguous as well. And I apologize, by the way, in advance for kind of talking in circles sometimes. I'm trying to sort out the information in my head. Well, I would say atonal pieces of music would be good applications for those because it just kind of aids in their ambiguity. I think chord planing is a good way of putting them to use. I'll give you an example with stacked fourths. This is from Sonic and the Black Knight. It's a cutscene called Merlina's Request. It was composed by Yutaka Minobe. So, it really, well, it's really ambiguous. It just kind of like, and it's just moving along, and there's no real time signature to that either, so that's kind of aiding in that impression. Um, and so that's certainly not the only way you can put those to use, but I think that the ambiguity of the chord is really what I'm getting at, and you can play that up and decorate it by putting it in situations where you can highlight that. Um, so, or you can throw them in as a sort of contrast to something that's more focused. So maybe you have a bunch of normal triadic chords going around, and you throw in a chordal one somewhere in a place of real emphasis in the arrangement. That might be a good place to put it to use, because then it'll contrast really heavily with everything that's surrounding it, and that'll kind of highlight it and make the impression a lot stronger. So there's something. No, I won't mention that. So let's see. So Zero Mission X Flareon is asking, is there anything cool or interesting things you can do with F sharp minor? Do you mean the chord or the scale or the key? I mean, if you mean the chord or the scale, well, I would suggest trying it in any key you can think of. So like an F sharp minor chord, well, that's going to sound one way in the key of F sharp, and it'll sound completely different in the key of A. It's going to sound very striking in the key of A and very different and like sort of bold in the key of A, but it's going to sound very much at home in the key of F sharp. It's going to sound different in all 12 of the keys, and so it's worth trying that chord out in all of them and seeing what it sounds like. Same goes for the scale as well. It's going to sound different in all of the keys because you're going to be comparing it to all of those 12 different root notes, and so it's worth trying it in all of those to see how it sounds. As for the key, just working in F sharp minor, well, it's worth thinking about your instruments, because, well, certain instruments are going to sound different in different keys than others, and the reason for that has to do with, well, the way that the instrument's set up and performance techniques and things like that. Because there are certain, on a standard tuned guitar, there are certain notes that you'll be able to get to in certain positions in the key of F sharp that you wouldn't be able to in other keys quite so easily. So, for example, in the key of F sharp on a standard tuned guitar, like working with F sharp minor, I have access to like the open A. Actually, yeah, all the open strings except for G, unless I'm using Phrygian for some reason, I have access to, and so that those are going to sound thinner than fretted notes, and so it's going to give a different tone. And that sounds like a very tiny thing to note, but it's something worth paying attention to and being aware of, because little tone differences in your instruments really do have a big impact on the way that a piece of music comes across. And so, the same goes for every other instrument. So there are going to be certain keys that certain instruments will sound a certain way in versus another, and so it's worth trying those out. Jordan Blackie is asking, if you were writing using the Locrian scale, for example, which chord should the melody resolve on generally? Well, resolutions... The problem with Locrian is that your tonic chord is diminished, and that's really tough to work with, because it's not really a proper resolution. So you could use that, or I might recommend going ahead and raising the fifth in your tonic chord when you're working with Locrian, and resolving on that. So Thomas Garcia says, thoughts on chromatic mediant modulations. I adore chromatic mediant modulations. I think it's my favorite type of modulation. So I abuse the heck out of those. Maybe I don't. I really love those, but I don't consciously think about like I try to compose true to whatever the topic is that I'm writing about. So I try to avoid letting my instinct run away from me when I'm composing. And so maybe I don't use that type of modulation as frequently as my affinity for it might suggest that I do. I'll have to look into some of my music and see if I do. But yeah, I love those sorts of modulations. So that kind of modulation is, for those who don't know, so a chromatic mediant is, well, first of all, maybe I'm misunderstanding the definition. I'm thinking of modulating to a key whose tonic is a chromatic mediant of whatever key you're currently in. Maybe I have that definition wrong. So an example might be going from the key of G to the key of B flat. So B flat is a chromatic mediant in the key of G, and chromatic meaning it's outside of the typical the default scale, and mediant meaning it's a third in either direction from the tonic. So I'll show you my favorite example of that, and this is from a song. I don't know the name of it. It's in Japanese. But I know how to find it. It's track 9 on the Atelier Verona Arranged Tracks album. It was composed and arranged by Hayato Asano. And there's this one section where it modulates up a minor third, and it's really fantastic. Let me find it. So the modulation is coming up here in just a second. So there's that. I love those types of modulations. Let's see. So Arceus is asking, do you play jazz guitar? Depends on how you define play. Not very well. So I mean, I know all my jazz chords and stuff like that, but I'm more accustomed to playing rock. Look at this chat. Oh, Elmer Bernstein, thank you. Yeah, that's the name of the composer who did To Kill a Mockingbird. Thank you, Stephen. So Zachary Silat is asking, to stay on topic, how do I make a song seem like it's in a mode rather than having it feel like it wants to resolve to the tonic? So what he's asking here, so a mode is a basic definition of a mode is a rotation of a scale. That's basically what it is. So if you have the C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, a mode of that would be to kind of rotate that around so that your starting place is one of the other notes. So say you're working with Lydian, all right, so start on F, you rotate that around, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. So it's the same exact notes, but you have a different center of gravity. And it can be tough to work with that because just the way the intervals are spaced, you can accidentally tonicize whatever the relative Ionian is of that. So C is Ionian. So C major is Ionian, and modes. How do I say this? If we have F Lydian, which would be the C major scale starting on F, basically, it's easy to accidentally tonicize C, because C is kind of the parent scale of all of that, and its intervals are set up a little bit better for that sort of thing. Here's a way to think about it. Methods of tonicization do not modulate with you. So just because you raise your 4 doesn't mean that your 4 is going to function the same way it did previously. So if you have, if you're working in the key of F, your 4 is going to be B flat. Raised 4 is B. They're very different notes, and they're not going to function the same way at all. And so, if you try to use your 1-4-5 progressions to keep things tonicized and keep things grounded, and adjust those for whatever mode you're working in, it's not going to work. It can't, because there's only one way to there are multiple ways to tonicize things, but those methods don't shift as you shift the notes in the scale. It doesn't work that way. And so if you're going to try to... the takeaway from that is if you want to tonicize something, maybe you have to ditch your scale for a second and maybe flatten. So if you're working with Lydian, maybe you have to flatten your 4 once in a while. In order to move around intervals in a way that's going to remind the listener that F is the tonal center. There's a lot of ways to go about that. You can, and some modes are going to be easier to work in than others. Lydian's very tough to work with because you're altering the 4, which is, like I said, one of the 2 stability degrees, one of the 2 anchors. So if you have there are multiple ways of going about it, and it's a little tough for me to answer this question because tonicization is a more complicated subject than people might think, and it's not something that I have all my thoughts collected on. But I do have a few suggestions for you to just try out. Number 1 would be emphasis, emphasizing the tonal center. So maybe pedaling it as the root is a good way of reminding the listener of where the tonal center is. Another way would be to to use cadences to your advantage and to think about rhythm as well. That's really, really important. Rhythm is absolutely essential to tonicization. So if you have something in like 4-bar sections, put your 5 chords at the ends of your 5 or any other chord that would suitably substitute for that. So flat 7, if you will, on the last bar of your sections so that you pull towards your tonic. And you don't even necessarily have to resolve on the tonic, but just make sure that you're pulling towards it during points of rhythmic stress. So that way you combine harmonic stress and rhythmic stress together. And that's a really phenomenal indicator of where your tonic is, even if you never play your tonic. Zelda's theme from Ocarina of Time is a fantastic example of this. It's in the key of G, and it actually never uses the G chord except for the one section that's in C. But the A section of that song is in the key of G, and it makes this clear by putting cadences at points of rhythmic stress. So there's harmonic stress and rhythmic stress coinciding that point you towards G as being the tonal center. So, I think I had one other piece of advice for that. Oh, so, well, that's just to see how other songs are doing it. So if you have a song that's working in a mode and you want to know how they're keeping it grounded, well, transcribe it, work out the chords and the melody, and see how they're going about doing it, and see if there's anything you can draw from that to try and implement. And maybe it'll take some trial and error, but you might, or maybe transcribe multiple songs and see what the commonalities are between those, and if there's anything you can draw from that, you can take away from that to apply to keeping things grounded. Modes can be tough to work with, especially if you alter your 4 or 5. Everything else is pretty much okay. I should scroll down on the chat once in a while. I'll answer a few of the questions that were asked like very recently, and then I'll scroll back up. So I'm gonna try and get to all of these. Well, actually, I'll answer this question about Zelda's Lullaby because I just talked about it, but then I'll scroll back up. So Thomas Garcia says, wait, so what chords does Zelda's Lullaby use then if it doesn't go to the tonic? So Zelda's Lullaby, well, the opening bit, it's like, what is it? It's C major 7, F sharp diminished over C. Does he use a D in there? D7 over C, whatever. It's basically the same thing. F sharp diminished over C. I can't remember if there's a D in that chord, but goes back and forth between those, and then it starts to walk down. So it's B minor 7, B flat diminished 7, A minor 7, D7. That's actually a Royal Road progression right there. The Royal Road is a famous Japanese chord progression. It goes 4, 5, 3, 6. In Roman numeral terms, and so in the key of G, it'd be C major 7, D7, B minor 7, E minor 7. It's a variation on that. C major 7, D7 over C, so it's inverted. B minor 7, and then B flat diminished 7. That's an inverted E diminished 7, and so it's an alteration of that. So all that's doing is following the circle of fifths. That's it. So if you think of D7 as being like F sharp diminished, so it's like 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5. You're just going along the circle of fifths, which is really absolute, just fantastic. Never gonna give you up chord progression. Yeah, it's that one. Alright, so let me scroll back up. So Fallen White says, is there any sort of online reference for the sorts of things that modes do? I keep hearing these examples, but never anywhere to refer back to read them. Well, I'm sure that there are plenty of online references to discuss modes, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. I did write an article for VGM Academy on the Dorian mode, and I kind of talked a little bit about modes as a whole in that. Geez, that was 2 years ago. It wasn't 2.5 years ago. So I'll link that here if you're... Oh gosh, that's a giant Google link. Okay, let me go to it first and copy that. So you can read that if you're interested. Maybe it'll be useful. Frankly, I don't remember half of what I wrote in that. Let's see. So Subfuture says, "Hi, I'm super new to music and want to find some good book-type references I can work through by myself to learn music theory. Do you have any guidelines? As a hobby, but I always learn best with books." Well, there's one book that I haven't read too much of, but I haven't read in full, but I've read bits and parts of it. And it's called Harmony by Walter Piston. And from what I've seen so far, it seems to be pretty solid. So that might be worth looking. He's very clear in how he describes things, and he's very organized about it. It discusses theory from a very classical perspective, and that's admitted to in the book. So it doesn't really go beyond that. But if you're new to working with music theory and stuff, then that might be a good one to look at. It was written in like the 40s, I think. So I may have that wrong, but I think that's when it was written. Other than that, I don't have any any particular recommendations. But if you join the Ongaku Concept Discord, which I should get a link to. I'll put the link in the description. It should be there. Maybe you have to refresh to see it. Yeah, so if you go there, I'm sure people would be more than happy to recommend books that they've read. Or you can just look on Google. I don't know. Silva Lucid, hi. I believe you are the same as the user on Twitter. Nice to see you here. Is asking, why are keys with sharps supposed to be brighter than keys with flats, even without any relation earlier in the song? How would something like G flat or F sharp work? So when we're referring to, well, okay, let's first ignore the idea of just intonation for a moment. Let's assume we're working with equal temperament. I don't think that there's any difference between G flat and F sharp in that regard. Generally what people mean when they talk about, at least in my experience, maybe people mean other things that I'm not aware of, but in my experience, when people refer to flat and sharp keys, and in particular scales, they're usually referring to things like, say, well, we would say that Lydian is a very bright mode because it has a raised 3 and a raised 4 and 6 and 7. And in contrast, Phrygian would be very dark because it has a lowered 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th. And we say, well, raised means sharp and lowered means flat. And that is because those degrees are being compared back to the tonic. And so relative to the tonic, well, the flat 3 is lower than the raised 3. Flat 6 is lower than the raised 6, and so on and so forth. And and as a result, well, the ones with lowered tones are considered to be darker in color, and the ones with raised tones are considered to be brighter in color. I don't know why. It's just kind of the association that we tend to give it. And some of that's probably cultural, but it seems to be consistent with other cultures. They just have different words to describe it. It's really fascinating, and I'm not sure exactly what it all means, but yeah. But if you are referring specifically to, like, you know, maybe people say like E flat is a darker key than um, D sharp, then I'm not sure what that would be referring to exactly. Maybe it has something to do with just intonation and the differences in how you would play the instruments as a result. I'm not sure. So if you modulated from F sharp to B, it would be considered brighter, but from D flat to G flat, it would be considered darker. Let me get my intervals correct first. Yeah, so those are both a fourth. I don't think so. I mean, with equal temperament, the distance between notes is all the same regardless. Um, so I don't think that. Well, I think that the relative uh, distance between the two would be exactly the same. You would. It is fair that you'd have to consider the instruments that you're working with because, well, obviously F sharp is going to be lower than G, or higher if you go an octave up from almost an octave up from G. So the the exact notes and the exact positions that you play on the instruments is going to be different, and that's going to change the tone of them because if I'm playing way far down on the neck on a guitar, it's going to sound brighter than if I'm playing up higher. Even if it's only by a few frets, the tone is still going to be slightly different. And but that's more of a position issue and like a range issue than it has anything to do with the actual keys themselves. So let me scroll back up. So I think I saw your username last time I streamed and I didn't know how to pronounce it, and you said it was the what was it? It was the like the two lines that you use for gosh, I forget the mathematical term. Whatever. He's asking about how many incompleted or dead / in progress musical works do you have? I don't know, maybe a few hundred. I don't compose as often as I should, but I do have a lot of incomplete works, and ones that I never intend to come back to, and some that I do intend to, but I just haven't. So. Do I have any online resources for composing techniques in specific genres? No, I don't. That sounds really interesting, though. I like that idea a lot. I really don't have recommendations from many resources at all. I really do a lot of my study myself. So Jordan Blackie says, I really like your concept albums. Do you have any tips for orchestration? First of all, thank you very much. I'm really proud of those albums, and yeah, so that means a lot to me. As for orchestration, I mean, well, first of all, I'll say I've never studied orchestration formally. I mean, I've never studied anything musical formally. Really, I study by listening to songs that I like and seeing what they do. So, all my orchestration I've learned through trial and error and by studying music that I like. Tips for orchestration is pretty broad. Well, I'll say this, and this is kind of a general arrangement tip rather than necessarily orchestration itself. Uh, I would say give a role to your instruments at any given point. They should each have some particular role that they are playing. And that role might change throughout the piece, and maybe quite quickly, um, but it needs to have a particular place that it's sitting. And so, what I mean by that is maybe you have an instrument that's playing the melody. Okay, well, that's its role. It's in the spotlight. It's playing this melody, uh, and then you have another instrument that's kind of filling in the gaps way up high, like maybe an octave or two up or something, and that's what that's role. What that instrument's role is. So each instrument should have a clearly defined role, and it shouldn't be stepping on the toes of the other instruments, unless, of course, that's what you want. Otherwise, I'd recommend segregating these roles out and letting them each kind of fill their own space. They all need to. It's like the same sort of advice that you hear people give to musicians in bands. It's like, well, you can't all be the soloist. You have to listen to what each other is playing, and fill your place, and be humble about it to some degree, and so I think the same is so. I kind of think about orchestration as directing a play of some kind. So it's like I'm putting on this kind of performance, and all of the instruments are my actors, essentially. And so they each have their lines and they each have their roles, and I direct them where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to say and how they're supposed to say it and so on and so forth. And maybe some of those actors will take other parts throughout. So maybe one of them will play multiple roles throughout the piece of music, but they can only really have one role at a time. I mean, I know you can say, like, well, if you have like a solo piano piece, then like it's fulfilling all the roles at once, and so, but I think you get what I mean. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is make sure that that your instruments are organized in some way. Scroll down. So Jason Miller asks what my favorite key is. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't really have a preference. Like on the guitar, well, I don't really care. As long as I'm not using open chords, I don't really care what key I'm in on the guitar. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there's a way I can answer that, really. I mean, maybe I use certain keys more often than others. I feel like that would probably be coincidence if I did, though. So, generally when I pick a key for a piece of music, it's unless there's a specific reason why I might choose one key over another. So for example, if I'm writing a guitar dominated piece of music and I want to use a lot of harmonics, I might pick a key that gives me access to the harmonics very easily on the guitar. Or maybe I might have some other reason to pick one key over another. But generally speaking, I just pick keys based on whatever is in my head at the time. So if I have a song idea in my head, well, my head's already chosen the key, and so I just work from there. Um, Chopsticks. There we go. So that's a clever username. Um, do you often have to deal with Freudian slips when writing music? That's an interesting term to use. I assume you mean maybe something like well, little ticks or quirks or things that I might do by habit that kind of sneak their way into my writing. Yes, that is something that's troublesome for me. I say troublesome as in like it doesn't normally cause issues when I'm writing. Uh, if I'm improvising though, it really does cause trouble because when I improvise, it's difficult for me to play things on the spot, and so I end up using a lot of well melodic and rhythmic phrases that I uh, that are natural to me, and so for that reason, I try to avoid improvising anything when I write. I'll improvise in my head, and that'll come up with better ideas than I will. Put it this way: I try to avoid playing an instrument when I compose, unless I need to work something out. I try to avoid playing an instrument when I compose, or if I do, I play an instrument that like I'm less familiar with, and so I'm less likely to play things that I'm used to. I don't touch my guitar. Put it that way. That's a good question, though. Like writing guitar solos is really tough for me because I tend to gravitate towards certain phrases that I use frequently, and it is frustrating because I really do want each piece of music that I write to be unique. And like I mean, ticks are fine, and like I think it's fine to have little things that you repeat, now and then, but it's like I don't want it to be like a whole solo to just be made up of that. Um, let's see here. So Alberto Mendoza is asking, where'd you go to school and what were music classes like? So I've never taken any formal music classes before. I'd never been to college either. Um, I have taken some guitar lessons, kind of on and off at different points in my life. Mostly to learn technique, but at one point during late 2012, I took some guitar lessons from a jazz guitarist, and the purpose of those sessions was not really to study technique so much. It was to learn music theory, because I wanted to learn more about chords. I wanted to expand my understanding of jazz chords and things like that because they didn't make sense to me. And so he really helped me fill in a lot of the little gaps in my knowledge at the time of the fundamentals. And by the time I stopped taking lessons in early 2013, I was able to take that foundation and then apply that to all of my self-study by transcribing things and working that stuff out. So... But I guess that didn't really answer your question. I haven't really been to any formal music classes, so I can't really tell you that. But the guitar lessons I did were like one-on-one sessions, and they I think I took them in directions that he never intended to go, because I'd always like bring up these songs from anime and from games, and I'd just play them from my iPhone, and I'd be like, so what is this progression, and like what's this doing, and stuff like that. I'd ask him questions about that sort of stuff, and that's kind of how our lessons went. I think it was probably, looking back, it was probably a little weird for him, but personally, it was really helpful for me, and I think I got a lot out of it. Chiaroscuro is asking, I really like the sound of going from a minor chord to a major chord a semitone below, just sliding everything but the third down. Is there a name for this? I don't think there's a name for that, but I know what you're talking about, and it's one of my favorite things to do as well. Here's one thing I absolutely love to do. I love chaining major sevenths and minor sevenths together, like back to back, going up or down. Well, mostly down. So it's like you have a minor 7, go down a semitone to a major 7, and that's really cool because the third and the seventh stay put. So it's like if you have an F major 7, well, let's say you have an A minor 7. So A, C, E, and G. All right, and then you move down to like an A flat major 7. A and E move down a semitone to A flat and E flat. C and G stay put, and that's really cool. I like that a lot. Sorry. Nicoli5 says, I skipped forward in the chat. He says, "Hey Josh, I've been going through your videos on your channel and have become a fan of some of your work. I really love your The Concept of Love soundtrack and find myself listening to it often." Thank you. I'm really, really proud of that. That's one of my favorite musical experiences I've ever had, and I learned a whole lot from that. So I'm really glad that you like it. Says, "Anyway, I really want to get into composing my own music, but I don't know where to start. I know basic theory. Do I just start composing, start transcribing, focus more on theory? Any recommendations?" Well, all of that, really. Definitely start composing as soon as you possibly can. You can know... So the thing about music theory, and I think this is really, really important to understand, music theory will not make you a good composer. It will not make you a better composer by itself. It will make you a more intentional composer, and one who is more self-aware, and that, I would say, often translates to being a better composer because you have a better grasp on exactly what it is that you're doing. But you're not going to be able to compose anything. You can know all of that information, and if you've never composed a song before, the first song you compose, well, maybe it'll be a little better than somebody who's never learned any of that to begin with, but it's not going to be very good. So there's a lot to say about just start writing. Like, just do that. Like, you have to start writing. Even if you don't know anything, try all kinds of weird stuff and just to see what happens, even if you don't know what it's called yet. But you really have to be practically applying the stuff that you learn with music theory. Yeah, so I would say, like, above all, start writing. You don't need to wait to learn any particular amount of information before you start. The second thing to do, though, I would say definitely is to transcribe. Like, transcription is... I can't possibly overstate the amount the level of importance that transcription has. Because it will enhance every single area of your musicianship except for physically playing an instrument. It'll make your ear better. It'll make your understanding of arrangement and composition and performance better. Um, you'll better understand different instruments. You'll better understand different types of genres. You'll understand how to arrange for certain types of instruments, and so on and so forth. And when I say transcribe, it's like you can choose exactly how you go about that. Maybe just start by transcribing melodies. Maybe later on you can start working on transcribing chord progressions. Maybe you can transcribe just like a little violin fill in a song, or just like one section here, one section there, whatever. You don't have to transcribe like entire pieces note for note right off the bat. Although that is something that you can do, and it's torture, but there's something really satisfying about it. So transcribe stuff that transcribe the sorts of songs that you find interesting and the ones that you want to be able to write more of. And then see if you can put some of those ideas to use. So by composing and transcribing and then using that information to help you compose something else, and that just goes in a cycle, and you get better and better that way. Fridge says, are there any favorite guitar picks that you use? Yes. Lately, so I keep coming back to celluloid. I've tried a bunch of different types, but I keep coming back to celluloid picks because they have like this warm kind of sound that I like. I've been using Snark celluloid picks lately, and they're a little bit sharp for me, but like once I use them a little bit, it gets a little, like the tip gets a little bit rounded, and that's nice. They're 0.7 millimeter. I might actually start going a little bit thicker on them, but I like them to be kind of middle ground. So that's what I use. I'm getting the Splatoon 2 soundtrack in a couple weeks when it comes out, and I pre-ordered it, so I'm gonna have that Splatoon guitar pick that comes with it. Pretty excited for that. So Ben is asked, and I'm aware I'm getting through these questions maybe a little slowly, but I will try to get to as many of them as I can. Where was this question? I scrolled down in the chat and now I don't. Oh, here we go. So Pinball Waluigi 64. By the way, have any of you played Mario Pinball for the Game Boy Advance? It's kind of an obscure game, but I enjoyed it. Maybe it was terrible. I honestly don't remember. I haven't played it in like a decade. He's asking, if you're into songwriting, how can one improve himself, particularly writing effective melodies without straight copying one's influences? Okay, so as for dealing with influences, the best way to keep from copying is to think in broad strokes when you're taking influence from other composers. And by that I mean, don't think so specifically about the exact notes or the exact rhythm that they might be playing or the exact chord progressions or whatever, but try and kind of zoom out a little bit from that and ask yourself how you might sum up what they're doing in a broader sense. So for example, there's a song on the Concept of Love soundtrack that I wrote called A Tennis Match, which is based very heavily on the music from the Mario Tennis series. And it's got I took a lot of influence from that music, obviously, because it was intended to be a reference to that kind of music. And to give a particular example, the drums were very simple, very simple patterns. Sorry. With a lot of like double kick fills, and so that was a way of getting some of that influence there without copying a particular rhythm. Like I didn't listen to any of the songs and like pick out exactly what the rhythm was. I just noted from like, well, a long time of listening to Mario Tennis music that the drum rhythms tend to be very simple, with maybe just snare fills and nothing else, and a lot of fast like double kick drum parts, and so that's what I applied to my track. As for writing effective melodies, and somebody else asked this question as well. As for writing effective melodies, well, effective kind of depends on what you're trying to do. Because what's effective for one melody isn't going to be effective for another. But as a general rule, I guess. Well, so here's something. Jeez, man. As a general rule, something that I see fairly frequently, and this was the case with me as well, for people who are new to writing melodies, is number one, there's not enough breaks in the melody. So it's just notes and notes and notes, and it just keeps going and going. And number two, the melodies are generally too rhythmically homogeneous. So it's all the same note value. So no breaks, all the same note value. And each note is different. And so that generally results in something of a very wandering melody it's difficult to make any sense of. One of the absolute best things you can do to instantly provide some sense of structure to a melody is to insert silence. So, maybe you have a melody that's like 16 quarter notes. Okay, maybe cut out one of the quarter notes in like the first bar and replace it with just silence. And then for the next bar, cut out two of them at the end. And then for the next bar, cut out the first one. And something like that, And I'm not saying that you have to do that arbitrarily. I mean, you can, but you get the idea. Just insert silence into it. Find good places to just stop and let the listener digest it. Even if it's only, maybe you can stop for a whole bar. There's a song, I forget the name of the song, but it's a Foo Fighters song that Joe Walsh played on. He's a guitarist, famous for playing with the Eagles. He did a guitar solo on one of their songs, and for the first like two bars of the song, he didn't play anything of like the solo section. He didn't play anything, and then when he did play something, he bent a note up and then just let that sustain and fade out, and he just didn't play anything again for another like two bars. There's a lot of silence there, and that allows you to digest what's being said, basically. And it doesn't have to be that long. The silence can be as small as like an eighth note. That's enough for somebody's brain to process that. It's like with run-on sentences. You don't want somebody to just like run on with this really long sentence with no punctuation or anything like that. You need to kind of give it some space. Whether that's silence or just a note that's being held out. And that goes to my point about rhythmic variation as well. It's good to use different note values, rhythmic values when working with a melody. So you don't necessarily want all of your notes to be the same length. You can, and I think as long as you insert some silence, that'll help a lot. But varying that a little bit would be good. Uh, Kind of on the other in what am I saying? On the flip side, a lot of newbie melodies that I've come across, and honestly, this is still something that I struggle with a little bit, is the sort of need to make every note different. It's like it's okay to play the same exact note a few times in a row. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, and So that's those are my tips for writing melodies. Um, Beyond that, as for improving yourself as a composer, well, I think doing some serious self introspection is a good idea. Um, because I really think the better that you understand yourself, the more focused you will be when writing music. Um, I mean, not to say that you have to like understand everything like perfectly or fully in order to do that, because music in its essence is an exploratory act. Um, but um, but I think the better you get to know yourself and how you approach things and your own mental processes for approaching, how you go about stuff, uh, and other people in the world and stuff, I think you'll have a better sense as to how you approach composition. And that's an ongoing process. It never stops. And it changes as you change because, people change and they grow, and, you have to start that whole process all over again. It's a continually renewing thing. It's, well, it's the dragon eating its own tail. Um, let's see. The Illusionist says, newbie composer here, how do you modulate effectively? I've tried to find videos explaining it, but I still don't get it. Well, um, essentially, if you understand how to tonicize something, which is to make, to establish whatever key you're in, which the traditional way to do it, and probably the most common way, is through cadences, so 5-to-1 progressions. Look up your intervals if you're not sure what that means. But if you're in the key of C, that'd be like a G chord going to a C chord, and that creates a really strong resolution, especially a G7 chord going to a C chord. That creates a really strong resolution, and it helps kind of confirm that C is the tonal center, because C kind of takes all of the G chords dissonance and resolves it and kind of puts out the fire, basically. And so if you want to modulate to a new key, well, you just do that for other notes. So you might have a cadence to some other note, and then well, that's called tonicization. And then to actually modulate, what you do is you take that tonicization and you confirm it. So it's kind of like when a text box pops up, and like when if you were to do a cadence to some other note besides like whatever your key is, so let's say you're in the key of C, if you do cadence to A, say E7 to A, it's kind of like a text box popping up and going, are you sure you want to do this? And then that's tonicization, and then to confirm it through modulation, you press OK by continuing to play in that key. So, you're not necessarily going to go back to your chords that were in the key of C you're gonna head over to A and start playing around in there, and you're gonna confirm it that way. Kind of like that. That's a rough explanation, but maybe it'll help you get some idea of it. Definitely look into cadences if you want to study that more. So Alberto asks, how do you approach writing music for video games? Well, there's a lot of things to consider when you're writing for a game. And it really requires talking to the developer or whoever your supervisor is who would know the answers to these questions. It really requires talking to the developer and understanding. Well, first of all, they might have some idea of what they want in mind, and so you kind of have to listen to that. And maybe you can make your own suggestions, but you do want to get an idea of what they're looking for. Remember that they are hiring you for your expertise. So if you are like absolutely certain that whatever idea that they have is not going to work at all, you need to be committed to that and tell them, well, this isn't going to work. Maybe that means you lose the job. And that's up to you, whether you just comply with their wishes and do something that you don't think is going to be in the best interest of the game, or you don't tarnish your reputation as a composer by writing something that's ill-fitting. I'm kind of getting into a different subject there, but anyway, you want to get an idea of what the developer wants and what they're looking for. In addition to that, you there's a lot of ways you can approach it, and it kind of do it all at once. You want to look at what the gameplay is like, really, because if it's very fast paced, then maybe you want a piece of music that's fairly quick in tempo. You want to think about so like if you have a sort of gameplay that's very hectic and has a lot of like sound effects and a lot of things to pay attention to, maybe you don't want a song that has a very commanding melody. It's nice to be able to want to make a piece of music that's like that really takes your attention, but there's a lot of things you have to pay attention to in a game, and maybe it's best that you draw less attention to the song than you want to. And so you have to consider a lot of things. You have to consider how long is the player going to be there. I mean, I don't think that a loud, bombastic like field theme would have worked for Breath of the Wild, because those areas are just so long and so outstretched that I feel like it would get annoying after a little while. And in addition, I don't think it would have fit with the aesthetic of the game, but that's it's not really a different issue, it's just another aspect of it. So you got to think about the gameplay. You have to think about, what kind of music is going to fit the area and like the setting and the mood. You have to think about how it's going to fit the gameplay and what the player is going to be experiencing, because you don't want it to be in a place where the music is frustrating them in some way. Because that's about the willing suspension of disbelief. You don't want to take them out of the game. Because that's not fun. And maybe that means no music at all for some section. Another thing to consider would be the bigger picture, because you want to have a unified theme. This is especially important if you're working with multiple composers, and something that most devs don't quite understand, in my experience, is if you're working with multiple composers, you all have to be on the same page. And even if you're working with yourself, you have to have some kind of a unified theme for the game. And so maybe all the tracks will use completely different instruments and stuff, but like, you want to have some kind of unity in the way you approach it, whether that's the instruments themselves or the genres or a certain motif that you weave through different tracks or something like that. But you want to have something to kind of connect it all, so it doesn't just sound like a mishmash of completely different tracks. So that's what I'd say about that. Let's see here. The musician says, "Hey, I'll throw a question into the mix. Do you think that composing and performance are entirely separate skills, or do you think that they need to be developed together?" Um, well, it's kind of two different questions. Yes, I think they're entirely different skills. Um, I mean, well, if you've performed a lot, then you probably have a slightly better idea of how to write a piece of music than somebody who's never played an instrument in their life, you know? But, and the other way around as well. Uh, but performance has a lot more to do with, like, your physical ability to actually perform. Um, and composition is a completely different mindset. So they are very separate skills. There's some kind of relation, but it's so weak that it's almost not worth mentioning. I would say, but developing them together is certainly a good like tactic. I mean, hey, you might as well put both of them together and learn them at the same time. Um, I will be right back, and then I will answer a few more questions, and then I will go. But yeah. So get your questions in then. Okay. I think my mic is working. Again, oh, I need to switch this back. Oh yeah, okay, cool. Should be working again. Let me know if my mic is not making sound. It should be. Let's see. Chopsticks asks, top 2 favorite anime. Non-Biori. And, maybe Clenad. I think maybe those two. Have you ever live streamed or considered live streaming blind composition? I think I've tried that before. I don't remember. I don't have any intention of doing it again, though, or doing it at all, because, well, streaming an attempt to do that just kind of puts pressure on me, basically, and it makes it difficult for me to do it. There's a lot. See, the other thing is that it'd be really boring to watch me compose, because I'm silent for a lot of the time. I spend a lot of the time composing just like sitting and thinking and letting my mind wander, and testing out ideas in my head. And I have to do it in my head, because if I try and do it on the guitar or on an instrument or some way that's audible, then I can't do it I can't do it quite as well as I could otherwise. So I don't think it would be particularly interesting, and there would be long periods of time where I was silent and there was nothing happening. I say long as in like maybe 5 minutes or so at a time. Yeah, so Mega Mario 1234 asks, does using solfeggi help a lot when making up a melody? Well, it's really more of a naming scheme for notes than it is anything else. So, I mean, I don't know that it helps any more than naming the notes with letter names, really. Have you ever heard of an app called Chordify? It's an app that'll give you the chords to songs. I have heard of the name. I didn't know that that's what it did. Most chord finders, in my experience, are relatively useless, though. So, have you ever seen Nodame Cantabile? I don't know how to say that. I've heard of it, and I've heard very good things about it, but I do want to check that out at some point. Okay. I wonder if I got any questions on social media areas. I probably didn't. Yeah, no. Yeah, I think, unless anybody has any final questions, I think I'm gonna go. But this was fun. I kind of half expected nobody to show up. So, hey, I'm glad that the people who watched enjoyed this, and I hope you got something useful out of it. I'll be uploading this to the channel well, once this is done processing, and yeah, so you can see it there if you missed an earlier part of the stream or you want to look at an answer again. I'll answer this last question though. So Chopsticks asks, tell us about when you Flurry of Flames asks, when are you going to be doing another Q&A? I want to do these monthly. So sometime next month. I don't know exactly what day it'll be, but it's probably going to be around the same time that I started this one. So, well, for me anyways, late in the evening. Yeah, but I'll announce that prior to it on Twitter and Facebook and probably Patreon if you want updates on that. Which, by the way, if you want updates for the channel in general. So here's an update for the channel in general if you... Yeah, because I don't think I posted this to Twitter. Yeah, there's been no... Aside from the one late video that I intended to put out at the end of October, the Nier Automata one that I ended up getting up on the 3rd, I don't intend to release any further videos this month because I'm working on other music stuff, and so I want time to work on that. But yeah, this video is going to be saved. I'll as soon as it's processed, I'll make it public, and yeah. But yeah, so Chopsticks asks, tell us about when you first started getting into music and composition. So I've always kind of had a passive interest in music, but I would download MIDI files from for like games on VGmusic.com and throw them into GarageBand and mess with things and stuff. But I first really started getting into music when I was about 13 or 14, and my dad showed me a whole bunch of old 80s rock bands and stuff, so like Journey and Toto and Satriani, stuff like that, and I got really interested in music then, and interested in the guitar in particular, and yeah, so I got interested in composition then. I really started, so I was about, that was around like 2009. That's when I started playing the guitar. And as for composition, I started really getting into composition around 2012, early 2012, and like actually seriously trying to write things and complete them. That's another thing. If you want to get better at writing music, complete songs. You really have to. It's important for like the way your mind goes about processing things, because it's like, well, if you don't complete it, then you just kind of save it in your uncompleted stuff and you don't have to think about it. Whereas if you do complete it, you kind of look back on it differently and you can think about how to improve the next time. It kind of goes on, under the covers, but it's a really important thing to becoming a better composer. But despite the fact that really all I listened to, and well, not all I listened to, but all I played and still play is rock music, I never found that very interesting to compose, because I was much more interested in composing just things that told stories, basically, and I didn't know that until years later. But yeah, so it was really when I got back into listening to video game music heavily that I really started composing more often. I would say the single most impactful musical event of my life really was watching the first episode of Chimera Mosaic, which is a fairly mediocre anime, in my opinion. But the first episode of that Well, the soundtrack is very heavily styled after British light music, um, and that was like just a really eye-opening experience for me because I wasn't terribly familiar with that genre. It's fairly common in anime, really, but that was, that got me hooked on British light music, and that's all I've ever wanted to write since. So yeah. Anyway, so I'll be going now. Like I said, this stream will be archived. I'll make it public as soon as it's done processing, and I'll do another one of these sometime next month. I'll let you guys know on Twitter and such beforehand. So, thanks for watching. I really enjoyed answering your questions, and I'll see you guys next time.